I want to share an important video with you. In fact, I feel this video is the most important video centered around ILR. It's talking about the new ILR proposals, and you can listen to government officials as they discuss the things they want to implement, their intentions around it. It gives you more clarity. There are a lot of questions on my previous videos that have been answered in this particular video. So if you listen to it till the end, then you will understand it better. I feel the first thing you need to know is you need to study the behavior of the government. The same way they are studying the behavior of migrants to get the maximum benefit from migrants. That is the same way as a migrant. You need to study the behavior of the government so that you know how you plan your family life around it to get the maximum benefits, because at the end you might just lose out from this relationship. It should be a good relationship between the government and migrants so that both parties benefit. But if you don't listen to their intentions, if you don't know how they plan their activities and the new rules they want to implement, you might lose out because you are not aligning with what their intentions are. If you get what I mean. That's why I share videos on this channel. I share information on this channel so that you can plan ahead of time. By the way, if you're someone who is so busy, just play it in the background as you're carrying out your daily activities. It's so important for you to listen to all the questions answered till the end. Let's go.
Can I welcome our witnesses to our first evidence session on the short inquiry we're doing on the changes to immigration status that the government has announced. We are looking into what we can feed into the consultation, and we're very grateful to have a panel to start with to give us a background and briefing on the situation. And perhaps if I can start at that end and ask the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll go into questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Nick Rollison. I'm the Head of Immigration at Kingsley Napoli, a London law firm.
Thank you.
I'm Alan Manning. I'm a Professor of Economics at LSE and also an ex-chair of the MAC.
I'm Madeleine Sumption. I'm Director of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, also Deputy Chair of the MAC.
Thank you very much. We're going to start our questions with Ben Maguire.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks all our guests for coming in today. We're obviously looking at the earned settlement proposals that the government have announced, and I was keen to hear what you think are the main objectives that the government are trying to achieve with these planned changes to settlement, first of all.
Yeah, I mean, I think the consultation is not that specific on the aims of the particular measures, which is not unusual for a high-level political document, but I do think when scrutinising them, it's useful to think through exactly what kinds of things the government is trying to achieve. I see basically four main goals of settlement policy. So the first is basically selection. So you're saying, is someone comes in on a particular visa, but the government might want to make sure that they're still eligible over time. So if they had permanent status immediately, then if they lost their job, the permanent status is the last point at which you're making that decision. So you might want a track record of a few years to make sure they stay in employment or similar. There's no evidence, I think, on what is precisely the right duration for that to get that kind of track record. Although 5 years tends to be pretty standard across a lot of countries. The second is if our temporary visas allow the government to restrict rights in a way that may reduce some costs of migration, at least for certain groups. So obviously, traditionally, restrictions on welfare benefits has come as part of the package as being on a temporary visa, payment of immigration fees, which changes the economics of those visas. That doesn't necessarily have to be attached to the temporary visa versus ILR distinction, but traditionally it has been. The third goal, I think, potential goal is to incentivise integration-related behaviours like, for example, learning the language or entering employment. And I think that, for the most part, the duration of settlement doesn't really do this. In fact, it might have a negative impact, as I expect we'll discuss. The criteria for settlement may well have an incentive effect. For example, although we can look at in detail at the specific criteria, a lot of the criteria are not the kinds of things that people control. People can't just decide to get a job earning £50,000, for example, and have the qualifications for that. But in theory, you could see some kind of incentive effects based from the criteria. And then the last one is to kind of change the attractiveness of the country. Typically, when people talk about settlement and attractiveness, they're usually talking about a shorter route in order to attract particular people, but the government might want to deter people through a longer route. There isn't a lot of evidence on whether that happens in practice, and it's actually not clear from the consultation document whether that is in fact the government's goal. But those, I would say, there might be something I've missed, maybe Alan will have other ideas, but I think those are the main goals. And then if you look at the different criteria, I think it's useful to think, are they actually achieving them, which I'm sure we'll discuss in the rest of the session.
I mean, I agree with that. I would just sort of add one thing. I mean, the consultation is called a fairer pathway to settlement. So there's this idea that, settlement is a privilege, not a right, that if we're giving people settlement, it's unreasonable to expect that they should have given us something in return, both in the past or likely in the future. And the implication, I think, of the document is the feeling is that in some cases not enough has been asked under the current system, so that balance of contribution relative to right is out of balance. I mean, I think that's the government's perspective on this.
And if I could just follow up, do you think these proposals that have been announced, and just more generally in terms of making settlement routes more difficult, do you see that as impacting migrants leaving the UK or even not coming to the UK? I'm just particularly mindful. I had some constituent casework last week where a married couple living in the US hoping to come back to the UK to settle, but my region of Cornwall obviously has a lot lower salaries than other parts of the UK, so that salary threshold, as an example, was particularly difficult for them to meet as a household income target. So do you see any of these proposals as either having an effect on migrants leaving because they just see it as too difficult to get their route to settlement, or as a deterrent as well?
I think that's very difficult to predict, and different groups are likely to respond in different ways, not least obviously they will face different actual pathways to settlement. But you have specific situations. So in the care sector, for example, I think that's one of the areas where if you're looking at people, either people already here or people who might be considering switching into the care sector as an international student, which is obviously still possible, if you're talking about jobs that people didn't really want to do, but they were doing it in order to get settlement, there's a big difference between having to do that for 5 years and having to do that for 15 years, for example, in the care sector. I think in other cases, if you've got a highly skilled worker who's actually quite happy doing that job for a long period, it may have they're less likely to be subject to the rules, and it may have less deterrent effect, although obviously the more highly skilled and highly paid someone is, the more options they have. And so it's possible that you might get some deterrent effect, particularly from, if you look at highly skilled workers, the mandatory requirement for spouses may make an impact, right? Does the CEO of some tech company, is his partner going to have to go work in a minimum wage job part-time in order to be able to meet the settlement requirement? That could potentially be quite unattractive. But I think broadly speaking, it's just really hard to predict precisely how people are going to respond to these rules.
I think the reality in many of the jobs is that the world is very unequal. So there are far more people who want to migrate than are being allowed to migrate. And so that, although there are cases where migrants who are sort of, shopping around for the best deal, most people who want to migrate don't have multiple offers. They're taking the offer that they get. And so places like the UAE or Singapore offer much less attractive deals, even under the government's, proposals, and yet are still managing to recruit, large numbers of people. So I think, although there are individual cases, I don't think in the big scheme of things this will make that much difference.
I should say I agree with that, actually. I cited those cases because I think there are exceptions where we might see an impact, but I think most people will stick it out. That would be my suspicion. Okay,
thanks. So just the final point to close in, following up on all of that, do you see any particular group being deterred from coming to the UK and seeking that settlement status, or is it too early to say based on what we've seen so far?
I mean, I don't think I have any particular suggestions.
You mentioned earlier, Dr. Sumption, about the skilled workers have obviously more options. Does that imply that those set of workers will be less deterred to come here, and other less skilled workers will be more deterred?
It's tricky to say, because actually a lot of the high skilled workers, the people with most options, often don't come thinking, I'm going to move to the UK, this is a permanent move. They might come and they say, oh, this is an interesting job in the tech sector or whatever it is, and then they decide, and they say, maybe I'll do it for a couple of years, and then they make the decisions later once they're already here. I think it's the people who are most set on getting settlement who move, knowing that settlement is very important to them and they want this to be a permanent move, are probably also the people who are less likely to be deterred by a longer pathway to settlement.
Can I just also add that I think that anybody who's going to be paid less than this around £50,000 and won't qualify for 10 years, our clients who are hiring people and moving people into the UK, from all over the world, are saying that will be very, very unattractive to tell their employees that they're going to have to wait 10 years for permanent residence. And part of that is to do with children, access to education, all the other things that you will probably talk about a little bit later. But it's also because global mobility programs for people on those levels, often they're paid more than that, working in large corporates, but they are well informed about what the relevant rules are in each country. And people often ask them, well, I'm going to this country, what's the deal? When will I get citizenship? If you're blocking people from getting permanent residence settlement, you're also blocking them from getting citizenship. So I do think there is a level of discussion which we see amongst clients at a real level, which is taking place, and it is concerning employers. In addition, employers are also saying that the requirement to have to sponsor people and keep them in sponsored employment for very long periods of time is also making hiring foreign talent very unattractive in some cases, unless they're paid these higher amounts. So there are winners and losers in this, and the migrants themselves may have less information, but employers are really having to think very carefully about what they do. And it's not just about people coming to the UK. Remember, we have a whole bunch of students here who can transition into sponsored work. If they are going into entry-level jobs out of university and being hired in graduate roles by companies, those employees will be at lower salaries for quite a long time, and they will not be able to count any of that time towards permanent residence, which means that those employers will have to sponsor them for a very, very long time. So hiring graduates in the UK is very unattractive now. It's already unattractive because the salaries are very high, but it's going to become even more unattractive for employers, which is going to affect migrants' choices potentially about coming to study in the UK, which also has a knock-on effect on other bits. So I think it's important to see that it's not just about the choice of going to from A to B. It's a number of different choices for employers and for migrants themselves, and it involves people who are coming here, but people also already here.
Thank you for coming in, and just a few follow-up questions from me. And just before we begin, can I declare this is support my office receives from RAMP. So one of the things is that net migration has been very high in recent years, over the last decade. It's obviously coming down now, but it sort of peaked at around 900,000 net migrants a year. How far do you think that was influenced by UK settlement policy and the deal that we offer migrants who come here?
Decrease in net migration?
Increase or decrease? What's the influence of settlement policy on net migration?
I would imagine not very big. I think, it's obviously very difficult to predict for the reasons that we've just been discussing. A lot of it, so international students was one of the big groups that drove both the increase, and also now via emigration is driving the decrease. And while many students are interested in settlement, they also, I think, are not necessarily looking that far ahead. And in fact, there's some research that the Migration Advisory Committee did that suggests actually people are often a bit over-optimistic about their chances. They assume that they're going to be able to sort out some kind of visa and don't necessarily realise actually sometimes they're quite surprised when they can't. And then you had other routes where it was quite uncertain whether people, obviously if you look at Hong Kong BNOs, for example, I think settlement you would expect, we know that a very high share of people expected to apply for settlement and that they were seeing it as a permanent move. If you have Ukrainians, that was another of the groups driving the change. The settlement situation is still very, very unclear for them. Care workers, obviously, if you think about the other groups that led to that increase and then the decrease, that would be a case where I think settlement probably was important, partly because of this phenomenon of a lot of people who don't necessarily want to work in the care sector long term, but saw it as a route to something else. So I think it varies. I think overall settlement policy certainly changes in settlement policy were not on the agenda at all, although some people would have factored in an understanding that they could get settlement.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that regardless of, even if a government really toughens settlement policy, it shouldn't expect to see a corresponding decline in migration.
Well, in some groups it might. So if you have a group of people who are coming in with the knowledge that they would, certainly if you took away the right for settlement entirely, so if you turn it into a temporary visa, then yeah, I think that would significantly affect the attractiveness. Yeah. Obviously the care sector, the care route is now closed for overseas recruitment anyway, but I think that would have played a role there. I think we don't have a lot of evidence, but the very limited evidence we do have suggests that the difference between a sort of faster and slower route to settlement for a lot of workers doesn't make a huge amount of difference. There's an experimental survey study that found that, but I think it's just very uncertain in this area to work out, how much quantitatively, how much impact would this have.
Okay, thank you. Let me test a hypothesis on you, see what you think, right? A government has very few levers to influence behaviour of people in the country, right? We've got the education system, and we can, teach people English through the education system and how we want them to behave. There's a criminal justice system if people commit serious crimes, but beyond that, there's not many. And obviously for migrants, when they arrive, they're generally not going to go through the education system. So what do you think about the idea that actually in Britain currently, the route to settlement is just wait out some time, pay some money, don't commit a serious crime, and you've got it? And actually this is an opportunity for a government in the 21st century to be more sophisticated in saying, yeah, there are some things we want to see people doing that we positively see, and we won't punish you for not doing those, but we will give you advantages if you do that, like contributing to your economy, like speaking English, like integrating. What do you think of that hypothesis?
Can I just jump in first? I hope you don't mind. I think there's a little bit of lack of knowledge out in the public about what exactly migrants need to meet in terms of criteria for indefinite leave to remain. It's not actually that simple. Each route has specific criteria which you have to meet, which might be going rates, salaries, or it might be innovation if you're on an innovative visa, or if you're on global talent, it might be earning certain income in the UK. They also have a requirement not to be absent for more than a certain number of days outside the UK over the 5-year period. They also have an English language requirement, which is B1 at the moment, which is quite high, so don't forget that. They also have to pass a Life in the UK test. We have clients who can't pass that because they don't have enough time to actually read the book because they're so busy working in their sponsored skilled roles. But it's not that difficult. So there's something to be said about the fact there are already criteria which people have to meet, and it's not just a tick box exercise. And in some cases, it's quite difficult to meet those criteria. So if you're on an innovator visa, for example, you have to show you've employed lots of people, that you've registered patents, all sorts of things. So each route has separate criteria, and it is not that simple to get indefinite leave to remain. I don't think people understand that. Adding extra layers of complexity on top of that might make some people happy, but it's not really going to solve the issue, which is that there are already people on a route to settlement where there are quite strict criteria that need to be met. And if you don't meet them, you can't get settlement.
I think some of this is sort of a little bit what I said earlier. It's about where do you sort of draw the line. So on English language requirements, I think you can say have those as higher or lower. I mean, personally, I think having a requirement for settlement, which is that, for example, when you're interacting with the state, you don't need to use translation services and things like that. For most people, that's not an unreasonable requirement to put on people to be a settled person in Britain. That's actually a bit higher, I think, than currently where we are in many cases. But you can also do those higher language requirements at entry in the first place. I mean, that's the other choice that you've got.
Yeah, just to add, if you think about the incentive effect, right? If the bar is very low, then obviously there isn't much incentive because it's very easy to meet. If the bar is too high and people think it's unachievable, then there isn't an incentive there either. So in theory, you're trying to find some middle ground that people can actually aspire to reach if the goal of this is to create an incentive for integration. I'm struck by the fact that if you look at Table 2 in the consultation document that has the criteria that then reduce your pathway to settlement, they are the volunteering thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is going to be quite messy to implement, is an exception. But for the most part, they are not things that people actually have that much control over. Certainly once they've arrived in the country. So they can't. A lot of people would love to earn 50,000, but they can't just magically say, "Well, I'm going to start earning 50,000 now." They can obviously control language, but interestingly, there are very few points. And language is we know that it's very important for integration, but it doesn't get many points in the table. It doesn't give you much of a reduction. The thing that I think is the single biggest change probably actually is the mandatory work, the fact that everyone would have to work, including dependents and family members and so forth. And I think that is a big deal and will have a big impact. The incentive effect, I think, is tricky. So in theory, you would expect that to effectively forces people into the labour market, assuming that they are actually employable and can find a job. Otherwise, the threat is that they effectively are permanently in a temporary status. So that is a very big incentive effect. Interestingly, so Denmark introduced a similar requirement, and the research on Denmark is slightly mixed, but perhaps surprisingly, it doesn't seem, there's one study that looks specifically at the work requirement, which doesn't seem to have had a big impact on increasing employment rates. And one of the reasons that the researchers hypothesized was that people were discouraged, that basically people felt that it was unachievable to have that, such a long period of work. And so then they sort of gave up on the idea and then were discouraged, and so felt less integrated because they didn't think they were going to get to permanent status. Now, I don't think that's necessarily exactly how it would go in the UK, and there are different studies that find different things. But I think you think there's a balance between the sort of incentive effect of sort of trying to encourage certain kinds of behaviour and then creating the impression that someone's just never going to get settlement, which can have a negative impact on integration.
Thank you.
And can I just also add that the language requirement for those coming into skilled worker roles is now B2, so it's pretty high. It's university entrance level, and that's the position now. So that's already been changed.
In some of our previous sessions, we'd heard that even with the 5-year time limit, people were not applying for permanent settlement at 5 years. It could be much later. It wasn't the priority. Is that still the case? Because the implication was extending the length of time might not have that much impact, as people weren't applying at 5 years anyway.
We see in the data people are applying after 5-6 years mostly. Yeah.
From our perspective, everybody applies as soon as they meet the criteria.
That's helpful. And
but can I just add, there is good data, the migrant journey data, which actually give you an answer to.
Go to the Migration Observatory website. Has a nice little table showing exactly when people apply.
Thank you. As I say, it was something I think we'd had in one of our briefings at some point, which did seem slightly odd. The other question is around the impact on the UK economy and government finances. What evidence is there of what these changes might have on that?
I think on the overall economy, it's kind of not that much, probably. In the big scheme of things, this is not that big. It matters a lot to individuals, but in the economy as a whole, not that much. On the public finances, it's potentially a bit bigger, I think. But that's, I think, mostly from the sort of, and the single biggest group I'm sure we'll talk about is sort of care workers who were admitted in the past few years, but will no longer be. So in some sense, they're a sort of a legacy group rather than an ongoing issue. So I'm not quite, just to give a specific example, if you think the salary threshold for the skilled worker visa now, where it is, which is 41,700, is it? Yeah. I can't see much point in having this extra higher 50,000 in there, because whether people are eligible or not for welfare benefits at that level of household income, they're not going to get any welfare benefits. So that extra 50,000 doesn't really seems to be adding complication. It means that it gives a positive incentive to employers not to give their workers pay increases, which I think is extremely undesirable. So I would be inclined to say, yes, we have the salary threshold for the skilled worker visa, and as long as you've been in line with all of that, the settlement after 5 years at the moment seems entirely reasonable to me.
How does that incentivise them not to give a pay threshold? Sorry, I'm not following.
Okay, because if you say you push your worker over that threshold and they apply for get settlement, they're then free to quit in a way that they're not if they haven't got the settlement. They can get another person to sponsor their visa, but that's obviously a bit harder. So it creates a positive incentive to suppress earnings.
Margaret Mullane.
Thank you, Chair. My question's to Nicholas. I'm a Member of Parliament for Dagenham and Rainham, and since this has been announced, my inbox is full. So I just wondered, do you think it's usual for the Home Office to, which you alluded to earlier, to make changes of this kind on an existing immigration route? And in the kind of emails that are coming in, it's the sense of fairness that is the big issue, I would say. So do you think it's fair to do this, to change the requirements?
I don't think it's fair. It might not be illegal. This is the issue, and I think the government will no doubt rely on the fact that legally they might be able to do this, but morally I think it's not fair. And also I should say that in the past the government and the Home Office have changed the rules for existing visa categories, but in most cases people on those categories have been grandfathered in. So they have been allowed to stay on the same conditions that they entered in until they get settlement and meet the criteria of settlement, which were those which applied when they first entered the route. That has been the case for most of the big changes to immigration routes and changes to settlement periods particularly. which have been increased, say, for spouses for the probationary period. It used to be 1 year, it then went up to 3 years, it then went up to 5 years. It went to 2 years and then 5 years. All of those changes were applied without applying them retrospectively. So people already in the route would still qualify within that probationary period. There's one exception to that, and I should say as well, we've had lots of immigration routes that have been closed, so the entrepreneur route, the Tier 1 general route, the investor route, but all the people on those routes have been able to finish their period to get settlement with some sunset clauses, so a sort of end date when they have to get settlement by, and some of those still exist. So the investor visa, for example, the sunset clause is not till 2028. But the one exception to the changes to settlement periods was 2006, when we saw the increase from 4 to 5 years for everybody on long-stay visas. And that was the one that caused the big furore over the highly skilled migrants, who then challenged the change of the policy in relation to their specific visa category and were successful on the basis of legitimate expectation. But those changes did apply to people already here who had to then do an extra year. And there was a lot of discussion at the moment at that time whether that was fair, whether it was in line with Britain's position as a sort of fair play country where the rule of law applies and legal certainty is guaranteed. I would say the government at the time came in for significant criticism. They tried to reassure people, saying there were lots of concessions and things so that people could adjust to move into this 5-year period. But it was a bit of a mess. It was a real mess, and I expect that if these provisions are applied retrospectively, we may see lots of legal challenges. But a very long answer to your question: no, it's not fair.
And can I ask, do you think there's any particular groups that you think will be particularly disadvantaged?
Yeah, so I think, clearly anybody who's on a sub-RQF 6, so anybody who's on a medium or low-skilled occupation who's going up to 15 years. We also have lots of dependents of people who are on skilled worker visas, who may not be working, may be looking after children. We have people on spouse visas, people married to British citizens or people settled here. We're told that the consultation won't apply to spouses, but I don't think that's quite correct, because the way that the consultation is drafted, there are mandatory requirements, and spouses of British citizens may have to meet the minimum income threshold in order to qualify within the 5 years, as well as meeting multiple other requirements on finances and cohabitation and so on, and English language. So I think the particular cohort that will be affected will be those on medium, low-skill visas, spouses, dependents, and obviously children. We're expecting, there's some questions a little bit later about children, but I think we would think that children are going to be really badly affected, because having one member of the family not being eligible for settlement will cause untold damage to the children, because their status is dependent on both parents getting settlement, and they can't get settlement without that, which then blocks their avenue to education, access to university with home student fees. So I think children as well are going to be...
And you're right, we are going to have some questions specifically on children later.
And finally, do you think that there should be some transitional protections put in place? And if you do, for whom and for how long?
I think that the issue around transitionals, the way that the government sees it, and the proposal seems to suggest that there might be some transitional provisions for those who fall, what they call borderline cases. So this might be somebody who's eligible for settlement the day before the rules come into place, or who might have applied for settlement and the rules change while they're applying. I don't think that's going to help at all if everybody is subject to this being applied to them retrospectively. So my own view is I don't think any of these provisions should apply retrospectively. If they are going to apply retrospectively, then there will need to be some very clear guidance about who will not be affected and who may be able to come out and get settlement if they're almost there. Because you can imagine there's going to be tens of thousands of people who will be affected if the thing comes in the day before they're eligible to apply. And I can't imagine how those people would feel. I don't know how your constituents would feel in those circumstances. And that is the problem, always the problem of applying these rules retrospectively to people already in the UK.
I just wonder if the other panel have any thoughts on the fairness and the retrospective.
I mean, I just No, maybe one observation. I mean, I think it's not a good idea to get a reputation for unpredictability about rules. So predictability is a good thing. I'm not sure I would say I would never do it. I mean, I think it's relative to the size of the problem. And I think the issue here is around the hundreds of thousands of care workers, really, which is a much bigger scale problem than, for example, the highly skilled migrants 20 years ago. So I think, is it absolute, or does it depend upon, what happens in the alternative scenario?
Yeah, just to add, I think quantitatively the largest group affected are the people affected by the mandatory work requirement. So if you think about, you've got family members of British citizens who are already here. You've got hundreds of thousands, and that's sort of maybe 350,000 or so. You've got hundreds of thousands of people who are dependents of either skilled worker or health and care workers, and then you've got British nationals overseas. So those are all quite big groups. And the evidence we have suggests that somewhere between a third and half of the adults in those groups are not working. So I think that single measure, in principle, affects hundreds of thousands of people. And then obviously that will, even for those who can go into work, they would have to do it for a number of years. And so that then sort of pushes back the settlement horizon for them. And then there'll, of course, be people who find it harder for whatever reason to go into work. So I think that probably, for me, that seems like the biggest single measure in the proposals. But I agree with Alan. I think aside from the mandatory work requirement, the largest one is care workers in terms of the numbers of people affected.
Sorry.
Just thinking about people who come from overseas to work hard in our public services and then find the immigration rules have shifted around them, what do you think is the risk of another Windrush scenario with these changes?
Can I just jump in there? I think there is a risk, and I think it's a real risk. Keeping people on sponsored work visas for endless periods, for up to 15 years, and requiring them to stay in sponsored employment, and not allowing them to have periods out of work, which seems to be what is being suggested, it runs the risk of those people who are either lose their job or unable to work and fall outside the sponsored work system, then falling into irregular status. And trying to regularise that status is going to be difficult because you'll have overstayed. You will then be subject to a 20-year route, according to these proposals. So it causes all sorts of problems, and it causes problems for children. It causes problems for families. So I think there is a risk. I think that the risk can be mitigated in a way because we know who these people are. We know where they are. We know what they've been doing. If they don't renew their visas, can we track where they are? Whereas I think before with Windrush it was a slightly different situation where people are arriving and being landed as settled people over a long period of time, staying here, being treated as British people. So it's a different thing, but there is a risk, I think, of people falling out of status, and you're just making that bigger and bigger the longer they have to wait till settlement.
Just to add on that point, if you look at the existing 10-year route to settlement under the family and private life routes, there's a surprising phenomenon where a lot of people entered that route and not that many people are coming out on the other end. If you look at the number of grants of settlement to people on the 10-year routes, they're very small compared to the number of people who went in 10 years previously. Now, we don't know how many, some people may have left the country, although this is a group of people who tend not to for the most part. So I think there is this open question, and it's not entirely clear why, but there is reason to believe that people are falling off the longer routes to settlement currently.
Thank you.
Wesley.
Morning, thank you for coming. I'm Peter Princely. I'm the MP for Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket. Before I did this job, I was a hospital consultant. So I'm interested in what the effect of this is going to be on healthcare workers and also care workers. And I think for those of us of a certain age who've had parents perhaps that have been in care, we're all aware that many of the care workers have come from other countries. And this is true in all countries, actually. What I'd like to ask, I think perhaps Alan first, is what do you think the implications are on primarily on care workers for this settlement change?
Well, I think if it's changed, there are two things that will happen. Is that they will, be sort of stuck within social care for longer than they would otherwise be. We know there have been quite serious problems with the way that some of these workers have been treated by some employers, so it's going to do that. They will also not be eligible for, welfare benefits. They're pretty low-paid workers on the whole. A Brit earning that much would, often be getting more benefits. Some care workers came in with children. I mean, obviously that's not possible anymore, but there are children. Those children would be growing up in probably some of the poorest households in the UK. So I think that's the sort of the consequences for them. If you look on the other side, the consequences for the government, if they are given settlement, it means sort of two things. Firstly, there's this eligibility for welfare benefits. That potentially can be quite a large sum of money for the government at a time when it doesn't feel it's sort of flush, basically. And secondly, it gives them the freedom to change employers. And it's quite likely that in that situation, many care workers will choose to leave the care sector for exactly the same reason that the Brits, don't leave the care sector, namely paying conditions are not really attractive enough. And that's sort of what happens, Canada with its caregiver visa, 10 years after entering as a care worker, 10%, 15% are still working as care workers. So I think those are sort of how I would see, the trade-offs in this question of whether they should get settlement on the existing rules or go to something else. I mean, 15 years strikes me as a very long time to wait. So even if you were to lengthen it, it wouldn't necessarily have to be to 15 years.
Essentially what we'd be talking about are tied workers. Am I correct in that? So you tie a worker to a low-paid job for 15 years before they're entitled to go for settlement and citizenship, which seems to me to be an enormously long period of time, especially in a situation where we're very short of care workers. So the net migration, I think, came down from nearly 1 million to about, I believe, 200,000 or so last year. So do you have a sort of ballpark figure in your head of what the number would need to be for us to sustain our care sector? Or are we at risk of having a care sector with no workers?
I mean, my view on the care sector, the real decision that is are you going to pay these workers properly, offer competitive pay conditions, yes or no? If you say no, you're going to obviously save the government money. You're going to have to use migration. That migration, I think, is going to have to be essentially temporary migration. That's what other countries, do in that scenario. If you say we're going to pay them properly, then there are lots of people who are able to do this job. It's that they don't want to do this job given paying conditions. I don't think you need a visa then, just in the same way as we don't need visas for supermarket workers and so on and so forth. So I think what we've had, unfortunately, is something that is a bit between the two, falls between these two options, and that's sort of why find ourselves in quite a difficult situation.
It feels like we're not really going to solve a problem. That's how it feels to me. So perhaps to Dr. Sumption, the political problem that there is in the country, I think, is that people see these boats coming over and they see these migrant hotels filling up. So do you think that the changes that are being proposed are going to affect any of that?
I don't think that the settlement changes won't necessarily affect the number of people coming in small boats. Obviously, there are specific, there's the proposal for people who've then entered the country illegally to have a much longer route to settlement, which could, in theory, have some impact, but to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to have a very big impact. Particularly, you've got groups of people who are coming over on small boats who have already been refused asylum in Europe. They have no other options, right? They're not choosing between multiple countries. They're coming to the UK because they've already been refused elsewhere. And so if you think about people in that type of situation, the 30-year route to settlement is the only thing on the table. So I wouldn't expect there to be a big impact on small boats. Can I just add a technical point on the 15-year route for care workers? And this also applies to the other middle-skilled jobs where you've got a route that's been closed, and then this is just a legacy. You've got this cohort of people who are in the UK. There's a challenge. If they still have to be with a licensed sponsor, we may over time see a diminishing number of these sponsors, right? Because employers won't have an incentive anymore to become a sponsor as the number of care workers. Currently, there's still an incentive to be a sponsor because there are quite a lot of displaced workers, they're international students. Over time, then towards the end of that 15-year period, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to switch jobs because there just are not going to be as many licensed care employers. And so I think there's a technical question about whether the government wants to do anything to try and increase mobility. And the government has no reason to keep people with the same employer. That just increases exploitation, right? They may want to keep people in the care sector, but it may require some thought as to how to make sure that people can still move around between jobs.
See, I'm worried that we'll run out of care workers. We've introduced some changes which are designed to lower the incentives to come to this country, but we might actually end up with not enough people to look after us as we age. And the other thing that, following from what Margaret had to say, is that there are definitely groups of individuals coming to see me who are very worried about the change in the length of time. They're already in the system. They're nursing assistants, actually, and they were expecting to get citizenship and indefinite leave to remain at time X, and now they suddenly see that disappearing into the future, and they feel massively betrayed, actually. And these are the people who are actually the main workers in our care and hospitals. So I'm worried about that. Do you have a worry about that too?
I think that comes back to the fairness discussion. I guess it's a fairness question and then it's a reputational discussion that we've discussed.
It feels like changing the rules in the middle of the game.
The other issue is to do with the care worker visa itself. I mean, the way the policy was designed, pushed by the Department of Health, sort of forced on the Home Office, very badly designed, no assessment of what the demand was in the market, no setting of quotas, no controls really, and very lax enforcement and oversight by the Home Office. So we've ended up with a very poorly designed policy which allowed a lot of people in, and now those people who came in because they were invited to come in by UK employers are being punished for it. And I don't think that is fair.
In a situation which, as Dr. Sumption said, isn't actually probably going to do nothing about the main political problem, which is that there are people who are desperate coming across on boats. Thank you. Yeah.
Want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, I'd go back to something I said earlier, that actually, although it's totally understandable that people who came in the expectation that these were going to be the rules are incredibly upset about that, whether going forward this affects our ability to recruit workers, I'm more sceptical. If you look at the overproduction of nurses in the Philippines, for example, they're just so, there's so many people who want to move to a country like the UK. Their tolerance for poor conditions, I'm afraid, is quite high.
Just because they have a tolerance for poor conditions doesn't mean to say that we should be tolerating poor conditions.
No, that's the moral issue of it. But I don't think the practical, means we're going to be unable to hire people is quite right.
Margaret Malay.
Yeah, we had a trade union day where the care workers were invited in to meet MPs. And what came over very, very strongly was at the moment, a lot of these care workers are sponsored. And if you have a rogue employer, to put it mildly, they are more or less saying to the care workers, well, if you don't like it, go. So following on, putting aside the sense of fairness, a lot of care homes are privately owned. It's an employer at the end of the day. And also as well, that if you're going to have work, it's hard work in a care home as well. So do you think that further up the line, when people are not going to come, that's how I see it possibly with the care homes. Do you think that that's going to have to be looked at again, sense of fairness aside, economically, because we won't have anybody to look after our elderly and people that need care?
I mean, I think it's been, basically universally accepted that social care, the funding, the paying of the workers is a mess. It has been for a very long time. And given ageing populations, and so on. I mean, my view is that we just have to pay care workers properly. And then all of these problems actually wouldn't really be there. The problem is we know that is going to cost the government money because, most of the fees are coming from the government ultimately. Obviously, the government is talking about, through the Fair Pay Agreement, putting more money into social care, but they've talked about an outer envelope, I think, of 500 million, which I just don't think is enough. And I suspect if you talk to the workers, they're more interested in the money in their pocket than the process by which the pay was determined. So I think government after government has failed to bite the bullet on this, which is pay these workers properly.
And there's presumably a real risk of genuine, very, very abusive exploitation of tied workers who are unable to move to a new employer.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not in favour of tied visas in jobs where the primary reason for the shortage is that their pay and conditions are uncompetitive. That it's not that we're short of people who are able to work in social care, we're short of people who want to work in social care.
Can I just add one thing, just to expand this a little bit beyond the care workers? because this will also impact anybody who's in a medium or low skilled occupation, and there are all sorts of roles that people are doing. Our experience is certainly in those roles, more than the highly skilled RQF6, the sort of degree level roles, finding a new sponsor if you're made redundant, there's an economic downturn, you have an abusive employer, is actually really difficult. And that's because if you go on LinkedIn or any job site, you'll often see that it says we do not sponsor roles in this company. And it's quite tricky, it's quite difficult to find a new sponsor because of the cost of sponsorship being very high, the additional compliance obligations that employers take on when they become sponsors. So if you fall out of skilled work, out of employment, going back into it can be really difficult. And if that break is going to cause a problem with your eligibility, if you're 12, 13 years down the line and you're almost at the 15 years, you can just see the problems that's going to cause, again, to your point about people falling out of status. And the other thing is, previously, this was less of a problem because the Home Office would take about a year to curtail your leave once they were notified by the employer that sponsorship had ended and you'd left. And so you'd have plenty of time to find another job and maybe find a sponsor who was willing to take you on. And you would still have status because you still have permission to be here while that was going on until your visa was curtailed and shortened down to 60 days. That is now happening much faster, and we're seeing decisions coming out very fast from the Home Office because it's being automated. So as soon as the employer notifies the Home Office through the sponsor management system that an employment has come to an end, you might be receiving a curtailment notice, reducing your visa from the 2 or 3 years that's left on it down to 60 days. So people are really in a race against time to try and find a sponsor, and that is often not possible. And to Madeline's point about there being less and less sponsors, particularly in the care sector, again, that could really be a challenge for people who are trying to find another job. And that needs to be looked at if this is going to come into force, as is proposed for 15 years. We can't really have a system where people are racing to try and find another job and then being penalised if they can't.
Nicola has got more questions in this area, I think.
Thank you. There's a certain cynical logic, though, isn't there, to the 15-year rule? Because if we're stopping care worker visas, we're tying current care workers into sort of indentured employment for that 15 years, because with incentives for their salaries to be increased so they don't break free from the system earlier. That is the logic of the system, presumably, and that's what's actually playing out here, isn't it?
I think there is a tendency for employers, some employers, like these tied visas because it gives them more power over their workers. I think that tends to be more of a problem in lower paid roles who, I think there are a number of reasons that they're sort of a bit more vulnerable to this. Often they are, most of the workers, so there aren't any Brits sort of around, co-workers keeping an eye on them. They may have language issues more and so on and so forth. But I think, so that's the downside of tied visas. The plus side of tied visas for work migration is that you've got an employer who's sort of putting their money where their mouth is. They're saying, I think this migrant is worth, so many thousands of pounds. And that sort of takes up the burden of selecting what sort of migrants we want off the government and onto employers. So I think they're trade-offs.
I'm not talking about the employer, I'm talking about at the government level.
Yeah.
Isn't the 15-year rule a way of maintaining those who've come in on care visas staying in the sector? Well,
It could be, and that could be part of the intention behind the proposal, but we don't. That's not made explicit in the proposal itself.
That is the logical outcome of what's happening, isn't it?
Except that I think some of the public sector work, it's not just public sector, this is private sector, and actually I think the proposal envisions for some of public sector workers actually a faster period to settlement.
Only if they're at a higher quality level, isn't it?
I thought
IQ6.
the degree RQF6.
If RQF6, yeah.
Yeah, so it doesn't apply, does it, to those on care worker level?
No.
I think one of the main goals, and from a policy perspective, one of the main benefits of the 15-year route would be to keep people in the care sector. Obviously, there could be some deterrent effect. If you've got an international student who came here and did a master's in computer science and then switched into the care sector in order to get settlement 5 years later, and they're currently 1 year in, it is plausible that some of those people will just say, I'm not going to do this for, equivalent to, half of my life again. But, so there could be some negative impact on retention for certain groups, but I think probably on net, it does in the short run, increase retention of that cohort of workers in there.
I'm not defending it, I'm just saying that seems to be a policy goal, it seems, lurking there. Moving to those on medium-skilled workers, you've made the point you don't think the 15-year, extension of 15 years will actually be acted as a disincentive out there in the world market. What are the problems, or are there any problems in extending to 15 years the qualification period?
Can I answer that one? I think the issue around medium-skilled jobs, it is all based on what SOC code or SOC code you selected when you sponsored the person. And I'll give you an example. We act for a large group of hotels that has a very big hotel in London, in a very prestigious part of London. The general manager of that hotel is paid a lot of money. But because he's managing a hotel, you look at the most obvious SOC code and you say, oh, he's a hotel manager. And because you don't really care about whether that's RQF 6 or below, that's what you give them. So that person is now on a 15-year track, even though they're doing a highly paid job, managing 500 people and a very significant business, essentially, where they could potentially have been put in at a higher SOC code had we really been bothered about it.
Does that matter with the salary? Because it will come down with salary.
So the salary will reduce it, but the person would still be increased to, say, 8 years to settlement. So it's still a much longer period. And if they were earning, in this case 8 years, if they were earning less, it would be 10 years. So you're still doubling the period for settlement for some of those people. So you have to recognise that these, what we call medium-skilled roles, some of them are quite well paid, they're quite skilled, and trying to put everybody in this sub-RQF pot is not great, because it'll affect everybody in that pot, including care workers and people like this individual who are highly skilled, but when they came in, the issue wasn't really about what their SOC code was. They just wanted to be here and do the job, because they wouldn't have been able to predict that this would have happened. And again, this goes to our point about the retrospective application of these rules.
So there's no way to retrospectively change the coding?
Well, the person could do a change of employer application and move into an RQF role, an RQF 6 role, but then they'll be starting another 5-year track. So again, these are things which our clients are asking us about, and they're saying, well, hold on, we'll just wait and see what is going to happen. And there's a cost to doing all of that every time you do it for the employer. So we expect to see a lot of movement, because people will be maybe doing jobs which could be defined as RQF 6, but it's just going to clog up the system with unnecessary applications, increase costs for employers and employees. So my view is that this doesn't really work, because it covers such a different, wide variety of people. If what you're trying to do is attack care workers, which I don't think is right, the knock-on effect is you're hitting a whole load of other people. So I don't want to create divisions between different types of workers and have different groups pitted against other groups trying to fight for things, which I think is possibly the outcome of this. Is really not very welcome.
Yeah, I think this is one of these cases where it's really important to work out what is actually the goal of this, right? If you're looking outside of the care sector at the 15-year route for the RQF 3 to 5 roles, if the goal is fiscal, if it's basically saying we're worried about the possible effect of paying welfare benefits to this group of people or no longer having their immigration fees, then it's not clear why we would care about the RQF level of the occupation independent of their salary, right? So the highly paid hotel manager that, in Nick's example, would comfortably have a positive fiscal impact. And so in some ways you don't need really to worry about the RQF number, unless you think there's some kind of enforcement issue about, if you think that salary is less enforceable than
can you explain it to me again? Sorry. Take me through that
so
again.
If you've got so the fiscal impact really depends on how much someone earns.
Yeah.
Depends on whether they continue to be employed and how much they earn. And that doesn't depend on whether their job is classified as RQF 6 or RQF 3 to 5, which is just a...
Doesn't the salary one bring it down? Does the salary reduction does allow, or the high salary reduction of time does address that issue to an extent, does it not?
But from a higher baseline.
Okay.
So they would still have
right.
Say the hotel manager earning 80,000 would have a 5-year longer path to settlement than a sort of software programmer earning 80,000, even though their fiscal impact
3 year longer. It comes down by 7 years, doesn't it?
Well, no, it depends. In our case, the hotel manager is paid more than 125, so it comes down by 7 years.
Okay.
So say it was 80,000, it would come down by 5 years.
You'd have a 5-year difference. So if it's fiscal, it's not clear that you need to worry that much about the RQF levels. If, however, the goal is to keep people in a particular kind of job, as we talked about for the care sector, then maybe you do want to distinguish. I guess particularly once you get into these private sector roles, the RQF 3 to 5, construction, hospitality, all of these different jobs, it's not actually clear that there is a policy objective, or there should be a policy objective of keeping people in those jobs, right? So Ryanair hired more than 1,000 people as air travel assistants. Do we care if they stay working for Ryanair or if they go do something else? One of the main reasons that people change jobs is to have something that's better fit with their skills, or to earn more where they will then pay more tax. So I think there could actually be a negative impact of keeping people in their jobs if they're jobs that we don't actually really care if they stay on or not.
Is there is it logical or practical to separate indefinite leave to remain and the sponsorship process? Could one have system whereby those without indefinite leave to remain didn't require a sponsor if they got another job, or is that totally impractical?
You mean if someone had a temporary visa, they don't have to remain sponsored for that whole period?
Let's say the example of someone made redundant, rather than looking for another sponsor, simply being able to go to another employer, or does that just simply make no sense in reality?
No, you can do that. Sweden does that, actually, for its temporary visas. They have an initial sponsorship period, and then after that, workers can move around even though they don't yet have permanent status. The trade-off there is just that, obviously, the Home Office loses a lot of control once they... once there's no longer sponsored. The sponsorship is the mechanism that enables the Home Office to see what someone's doing, how much they're being paid, etc. So if there's a requirement, if you just say people can actually go and do anything they want, then obviously there wouldn't be a compliance issue there. If you say you have to stay in the sector, but it doesn't matter if you're with an employer who isn't licensed, then that would be beneficial for the workers, and that you would inevitably lose some control about whether people are actually doing that.
And what if it's involuntary leaving their employer, the redundancy example? Could you just allow it for that?
It's a little complicated then when you're trying to look at the reasons. It's probably not impossible, but I think it would be trickier operationally and from a compliance perspective.
Why?
Well, because then you have to know why someone left their employer, and the employer then will have to say this is why the person left. Well, in different cases, the employers may or may not have an incentive to say.
In the example given of redundancy, surely the employer just said this person has been made redundant. They now can go into the job market. Why would that be so difficult?
I mean, it's possible to do it. You just need to change the whole system. But the issue is, imagine you're in a sponsored visa and you say to your employer, "I'd like you to make me redundant because that will give me free access to the labour market. Can you do me a favour?" Okay. So there is some scope for abuse there. But it's perfectly possible to design a scheme where if people are made involuntarily redundant, they might be given a longer period to find a new job, a new sponsored employer, or to be given access to the labour market. I don't suspect that will be an option the government will be looking at, because they're very keen to control all of this. Because they're very keen to control all of this, as Madeline said. So I think unless you get to the end of that period and you meet the criteria for settlement and you can leave sponsored work if you want to, or you still remain with the same employer but you're no longer sponsored once you get to settlement, then you'd have to design something entirely different, which I think would be quite complicated to manage.
Thank you.
Can I just check about the impact potentially on workers in roles essential to the UK's industrial strategy? Has anyone looked at any short and long-term impacts on that?
Well, the tricky thing here is that we don't actually yet know what's happening to the temporary shortage list. So the temporary shortage list is designed, obviously, to allow immigration in those roles. The government has not yet said whether they expect those visas to be strictly temporary or not. The time on the list is supposed to be temporary, but and some of the language implies that there might be no route to settlement at all, but instead it might just be a sort of time-limited, maybe 3 to 5 year visa. But I think without knowing, and those are radically different options, right? So 15-year, will it have a 15-year route to settlement like the RQF 3 to 5 jobs that we've been discussing? Will it have no route to settlement? And I think it's quite difficult to comment with so much uncertainty about what's actually going on.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, I think if you actually look at the people who came in the medium skill jobs, what jobs they're actually doing, it's actually a surprisingly small number that you might think are connected to the industrial strategy. I think the biggest group outside social care is chefs, for example. I'm not sure we think of that as them as part of our industrial strategy. So I think that sometimes this is a little bit sort of exaggerated. I mean, even when construction jobs were eligible, we didn't really see much use of it, because it sort of doesn't, the employer sponsorship model doesn't fit with the sort of construction, lots of subcontracting, lots and lots of self-employment, for example. So I'm not sure the proposed changes make that much difference to this. It's more about the temporary shortage list and how that works.
And bear in mind as well that the temporary shortage list, those people coming in since July, it's sort of the scheme has been narrowed so that people can't bring in dependents anymore. So it's looking much more like a temporary eVISA than it was previously.
Thank you. We're going to move on to children and families, and Chris Murray.
Thank you. I want to ask broadly, what do you think the impact of the proposals in the consultation will be for children and young people?
As you can see, the video has not ended. There are other questions being answered around children. I'll put the link to where I watched it from so you can listen to what they have to say. You know, watch it if you have kids. I just decided to stop here so that you get the most information you can. You can see how they plan the new rules. I'll see you in my next video. Bye-bye.